In the vast expanse of Wyoming's Teardrop Valley, where the wind carries whispers of fortunes made and lost, a desperate man made a choice that would alter the course of his life forever. Jackson Reed, a hard-working cowboy with calloused hands and empty pockets, accepted a marriage proposal from Vivian Montgomery, the 71-year-old heiress to the legendary Silver Crest Ranch. Their union lasted exactly 9 days before Jackson uncovered a truth so profound it would shake the very foundation of everything he believed about wealth, love, and legacy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1892 scorched the Wyoming Territory with merciless heat. Dust devils danced across the plains of Teardrop Valley, where Jackson Reed pushed his weathered Stetson back and wiped sweat from his brow. At 32, his face already carried the deep lines of a man who'd spent too many years squinting into harsh sunlight, chasing dreams that seemed to evaporate like morning dew. Jackson wasn't born to poverty. His father, Thomas Reed, had once owned a modest but profitable ranch just east of Willow Creek. Those days felt like another lifetime now. Jackson could still remember the smell of his mother's apple pie cooling on the windowsill, the sound of his father's hearty laugh as they broke wild horses together in the corral behind their cabin. But drought had come first, followed by fever. By the time Jackson turned 25, he had buried both parents beneath twin crosses on a hillside overlooking what was once Reed family land. The bank had taken the rest. Every fence post, every blade of grass, every memory sold to cover. Debts his father had kept hidden. A man's only as good as his word, Thomas Reed used to say. So Jackson had spent 7 years working off his father's remaining debts, taking whatever jobs would pay, breaking horses too wild for other men to touch, driving cattle through territories where outlaws picked off stragglers, mending fences in weather that froze fingers stiff as kindling. Now he lived in a cramped room above Brewer's Saloon in the dusty town of Copperhead Springs, trading work for lodging and whatever meals the saloon owner's wife felt charitable enough to provide. His worldly possessions fit into a single saddlebag: 2 shirts, a spare pair of worn denim pants, his father's pocket watch that hadn't ticked in years, and a dog-eared copy of the Odyssey his schoolteacher mother had insisted he keep. Reading's gonna take you places your boots can't, she'd told him. Jackson couldn't help but think she'd be disappointed to see how far he hadn't gone. On this particular afternoon, Jackson had just finished a grueling week at the Tucker spread, helping with the roundup. The pay was decent, $3 a day, plus meals, but as he rode his aging mare Penny back toward town, he knew the money wouldn't last long. Winter was coming in a few months, and he had nothing saved. A lifetime of hard work had left him with nothing but scars, and a growing sense that some men were born to struggle, while others were born to thrive. Copperhead Springs wasn't much of a town, just a collection of weathered buildings huddled together, as if for protection against the vastness of the surrounding landscape. Main Street consisted of Brewer's Saloon, Miller's General Store, a small bank that was only open 2 days a week, Doc Wilson's medical office, and a church that doubled as a schoolhouse. The air smelled of dust, horse manure, and the occasional whiff of freshly baked bread from Mrs. Miller's kitchen behind the store. Jackson tied Penny to the hitching post outside Brewer's and patted her neck. "Sorry, old girl," he murmured. "I know you deserve better feed than what I can give you." The mare nickered softly, nudging his shoulder with her muzzle. He stepped into the saloon, the familiar smell of spilled whiskey and stale tobacco smoke washing over him. It was early yet, only a few patrons scattered at the tables. Tom Brewer stood behind the bar, polishing glasses with a cloth that had seen better days. Reed, the saloon keeper, nodded as Jackson approached. "How was the Tucker place?" "Same as always," Jackson replied, sliding onto a bar stool. "Old man Tucker works his hands hard, but pays fair. Brewer set a glass of whiskey in front of him. "On the house? You look like you need it." Jackson raised an eyebrow. Tom Brewer wasn't known for his generosity. "What's the occasion?" "Consider it a going-away present," Brewer said, lowering his voice. "Sheriff was looking for you earlier, said there's some men coming from the bank in Cheyenne tomorrow. Something about your father's outstanding loans." Jackson's stomach tightened. He'd been paying those debts religiously for 7 years. "That's impossible. I've got receipts for—" "Interest," Brewer cut in. "Apparently there was some fine print about interest rates increasing after 5 years. Sheriff said they're talking about another $300. $300 might as well have been 3,000. Jackson downed the whiskey in one swallow, feeling it burn a path to his empty stomach. "I'll figure something out," he said, though he couldn't imagine what. "You could always try your luck at Silvercrest," Brewer suggested casually, refilling Jackson's glass. "Word is, the old Montgomery woman needs men for the autumn roundup, pays double what Tucker does. Silvercrest Ranch." The name alone conjured images of sprawling pastures, gleaming white fences, and herds of prime cattle. It was the largest ranch in 3 counties, owned by Vivian Montgomery, widow of the legendary cattle baron Howard Montgomery. Stories about Silvercrest and its eccentric owner circulated through saloons and ranch houses across the territory. "They say she doesn't hire drifters," Jackson said, "and I'm about as drift as they come these days." Brewer leaned closer. "They also say she's been getting on in years. Turned 71 this spring. No children to inherit all that land. Might be worth a try, is all I'm saying." Jackson considered it. Pride had kept him from seeking work at Silvercrest before, but pride wouldn't keep the bankmen at bay. "Maybe I will," he said finally. The next morning, Jackson rose before dawn. He dressed in his cleanest shirt, which wasn't saying much, and brushed the dust from his coat as best he could. He'd polished his boots with a bit of bacon grease the night before, and while they weren't fancy, at least they didn't look like he'd just walked through a cattle yard. Penny seemed to sense the importance of their journey. She carried herself with as much dignity as an aging mare could muster as they made their way out of town, heading northwest towards Silvercrest. The landscape changed gradually as they rode. The sparse, hardy grasses of the valley gave way to richer pasture land. Streams cut through the terrain, lined with cottonwoods and willows that offered blessed shade. In the distance, the teardrop mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks already dusted with early snow. It was nearly noon when Jackson caught his first glimpse of Silvercrest Ranch. The main house stood proudly on a gentle rise, a massive 2-story structure built of stone and timber with a wide veranda wrapping around 3 sides. Behind it sprawled barns, corrals, bunkhouses and other outbuildings, all painted the same pristine white with forest green trim. A wrought iron arch marked the entrance to the property, the name Silvercrest worked into the metal along with an intricate design of a stag's head. As Jackson rode beneath it, he felt a strange sensation, like he was passing from one world into another. A tall, broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked black hair stepped out from the largest barn as Jackson approached. He wore a foreman's clothes and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to giving orders. "Help you?" he called, his hand resting casually near the revolver at his hip. Jackson stopped Penny a respectful distance away. "Name's Jackson. Reed. I heard Mrs. Montgomery might be hiring for the roundup." The foreman studied him with shrewd blue eyes. "I'm Hank Sullivan, ranch foreman. We don't usually take on strangers this late in the season." "I understand," Jackson said, fighting to keep the desperation from his voice. "But I've worked cattle all my life. My father was Thomas Reed of the Willow Creek Spread." Something flickered in Sullivan's eyes, recognition perhaps. "Thomas Reed's boy. I knew your father. Good man with horses." "Yes, sir. He taught me everything I know." Sullivan seemed to consider this for a moment. "Wait here," he said finally. "I'll see if Mrs. Montgomery will speak with you." As the foreman strode toward the main house, Jackson remained mounted, taking in the sights around him. Silvercrest was even more impressive up close. The corrals held some of the finest horses he'd ever seen, quarter horses with powerful haunches and elegant heads, clearly bred for both work and beauty. In the nearest pasture, a herd of Hereford cattle grazed on lush grass, their coats gleaming with health. Everything about Silvercrest spoke of wealth, carefully tended. This wasn't money that had arrived overnight. This was generations of planning, breeding, and building. The Montgomery name had been synonymous with ranching excellence for decades. Sullivan emerged from the house after about 15 minutes. "Mrs. Montgomery will see you," he said, gesturing toward a hitching post near the front steps. "Tie your mare there and follow me." Jackson dismounted, his heart pounding unexpectedly. He'd never been inside a house this grand before. Taking off his hat, he smoothed his hair with his palm and followed Sullivan up the steps and through the imposing front door. The interior of Silvercrest was cool and dim after the brightness outside. Jackson blinked, taking in the polished wooden floors, the ornate staircase that curved up to the second floor, the paintings in gilt frames that adorned the walls. Sullivan led him through to what appeared to be a study, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive oak desk. Behind the desk sat Vivian Montgomery. Whatever Jackson had expected, it wasn't the woman before him. She was tall and straight-backed in her chair, her silver hair swept up in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes, a startling shade of green, were sharp and clear. She wore a high-necked dress of deep burgundy, a cameo brooch at her throat. Despite her advanced years, there was nothing frail about Vivian Montgomery. She radiated authority and intelligence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Hank tells me you're Thomas Reed's son." Jackson nodded, clutching his hat in his hands. "Yes, ma'am. I knew your father slightly. He sold me 2 fine breeding mares some years ago." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Please sit." Jackson perched on the edge of the chair, feeling utterly out of place amid such refinement. "Tell me, Mr. Reed, why do you seek employment at Silvercrest?" Her gaze was direct, assessing. Jackson had planned to lie, to present himself as simply a capable hand looking for work. But something about those piercing green eyes made him reconsider. "Truth is, Mrs. Montgomery, I'm in a difficult position. The bank's coming after me for debts my father left behind. I've been paying them for years, but they've changed the terms. I need steady work that pays well, or I'll lose what little I have left." Vivian Montgomery studied him with unnerving intensity. "Honesty," she said finally. "Refreshing in my experience." She tapped her fingers on the desk's polished surface. "How old are you, Mr. Reed?" 32, ma'am, and never married." The question caught him off guard. "No, ma'am. Never seemed to find the time or the right woman." She nodded, as if he'd confirmed something she already knew. "I'll be direct, Mr. Reed. I didn't bring you in here to discuss ranch work, though. I have no doubt you're capable. I have a proposition of an entirely different nature." Jackson's confusion must have shown on his face. "I'm 71 years old," Mrs. Montgomery continued. "I have no children, no close relatives. Silvercrest has been in my late husband's family for 3 generations, and I've managed it alone since Howard's passing 15 years ago. I've built it into one of the most successful ranching operations in the territory." She rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out over her domain. "But I'm not immortal, Mr. Reed. My time is drawing shorter, and I refuse to see vultures descend upon what I've built the moment I'm in the ground." She turned back to face him. "I need a husband, someone who can learn to manage Silvercrest under my guidance and inherit it legally when I'm gone. Someone with ranching knowledge but no fortune of his own. Someone honest, hard-working, and without complications. Jackson sat in stunned silence, certain he'd misunderstood. In exchange, she continued, your debts would be settled immediately. You would have a comfortable home, a position of respect, and eventually one of the largest cattle operations in Wyoming. I require only 3 things: loyalty, discretion, and patience. Mrs. Montgomery, Jackson began, finding his voice at last, I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting. Marriage, Mr. Reed. A business arrangement, nothing more. You would be my husband in name and legal standing only. We would maintain separate quarters and separate lives within these walls. After an appropriate period of mourning following my death, you would be free to marry again, if you wish, though Silvercrest must remain intact. Jackson's mind raced. The proposition was outlandish, almost unbelievable. And yet, the cold logic of it was undeniable. Mrs. Montgomery needed an heir. He needed financial salvation. Why me? He asked finally. You could choose anyone. Her smile was slight, but genuine. Not just anyone, Mr. Reed. I need someone who understands ranching, but isn't already established. Someone young enough to outlive me by many years, but old enough to be taken seriously. Someone who values honest work over shortcuts. She paused. And frankly, someone desperate enough to accept such an unusual proposal. The blunt assessment stung, but Jackson couldn't deny its accuracy. And if I refuse, then you ride back to town with my best wishes and never speak of this conversation. To another soul, she said simply. I'll find someone else. There are plenty of men in similar straits. Jackson stared down at his worn hat, turning it slowly in his hands. The choice before him seemed impossible, and yet, wasn't it merely a different kind of work contract? He'd sold his labor, his skills, even pieces of his pride over the years. Was this so different? I would need time to consider, he said finally. You have until sunset, Mrs. Montgomery replied. The bankmen will be in Copperhead Springs tomorrow, I believe. Of course she knew about that. Nothing seemed to escape Vivian Montgomery's notice. Hank will show you around the property while you think, she continued. I believe in informed decisions, Mr. Reed. As if on cue, Sullivan appeared at the study door. Ma'am, please give Mr. Reed a complete tour of Silvercrest, she instructed. He has a decision to make. As Jackson rose to follow the foreman, Mrs. Montgomery added, One more thing, Mr. Reed. If you accept my proposal, we will be married by Judge Thornton tomorrow morning. I don't believe in prolonged engagements. The next few hours passed in a blur as Hank Sullivan showed Jackson the vast operation that was Silvercrest Ranch. They toured the horse breeding program where Morgan and quarter horse bloodlines were, carefully combined to produce animals known for their intelligence and stamina. They visited the cattle operations, where Hereford and Angus breeds grazed on thousands of acres of prime grassland. Sullivan explained the irrigation systems Howard Montgomery had designed decades ago, the crop rotation that kept the soil fertile, the precise breeding records that ensured each generation of livestock improved upon the last. Silvercrest employed 25 full-time hands, with additional workers brought in seasonally for roundups and harvests. Through it all, Jackson's mind churned with Mrs. Montgomery's proposal. Could he do it? Could he enter into a marriage of convenience with a woman more than twice his age? Would he be seen as nothing more than an opportunist, a fortune hunter? And yet, what was the alternative? Return to Copperhead Springs to face the bankmen with empty pockets, lose Penny and his few remaining possessions, perhaps even face debtor's prison. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Sullivan brought him back to the main house. She's a remarkable woman, the foreman said as they stood on the porch. Smartest person I've ever known. Built Silvercrest into what it is today. When most thought she'd sell after Mr. Montgomery died, Jackson nodded, still overwhelmed by all he'd seen. Can I ask you something, Mr. Sullivan? Hank, the foreman corrected. And yes. Why doesn't she just leave Silvercrest to you? You clearly know the operation inside and out. Sullivan's weathered face creased in a small smile. She offered, about 5 years back. I declined. I'm good at what I do, but I don't want the burden of ownership. Besides, he added, his voice softening, I've got a sister in Denver who's been after me to retire and help with her boarding house. Few more years, I'll probably do just that. They stood in silence for a moment. She's dying, isn't she? Jackson asked suddenly, the realization dawning on him. That's why the urgency. Sullivan looked at him sharply. That's her business to tell, not mine. He nodded toward the door. She's waiting for your answer. Jackson found Mrs. Montgomery in the same study, though now she sat in a comfortable armchair near the fireplace rather than behind the imposing desk. A tea service had been laid out on a small table beside her. Well, Mr. Reed, she asked as he entered, have you reached a decision? Jackson took a deep breath. I have. I accept your proposal, Mrs. Montgomery. She nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. Very good. Please sit. She gestured to the chair opposite hers. We have details to discuss. As Jackson settled into the chair, she poured tea into a delicate china cup and handed it to him. His rough hands felt clumsy holding such a fragile object. From this moment forward, you will address me as Vivian, she said. You will be my husband, after all. Yes, Vivian, he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. Judge Thornton will arrive at 9 tomorrow morning. The ceremony will be brief and private, just ourselves, Hank and my housekeeper, Mrs. Perkins, as witnesses. After the ceremony, you will accompany me to the bank in Cheyenne, where your debts will be settled in full. She sipped her tea, her movements precise and elegant. You will have the West Wing bedroom suite. Your personal belongings will be moved. There tomorrow while we're in town. You will be fitted for appropriate clothing next week when the tailor visits from Cheyenne. The business-like manner in which she outlined their arrangement was almost a relief to Jackson. This was indeed a contract, nothing more. You will gradually assume more responsibility for ranch operations, she continued. Hank will guide you. Within a year, I expect you to understand every aspect of Silvercrest. She fixed him with those penetrating green eyes. Do you have any questions? Jackson had 1,000 questions, but one seemed most pressing. What do I tell people about us, I mean? The truth, more or less, Vivian replied calmly. That we met, found common ground in our love of ranching, and decided that marriage would benefit us both. People will gossip regardless of what we say. Let them. She set down her teacup with a soft clink. Now, is there anyone you need to inform of your decision? Anyone who might be disappointed by your sudden marriage? Jackson thought of his sparse room above Brewer's saloon, of Penny tied up outside. No, he said quietly. There's no one. A clean slate, then, Vivian said with a nod. That's for the best. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Silvercrest, Jackson Reed found himself engaged to a woman he'd met just hours before. Tomorrow he would become husband to Vivian Montgomery, master of Silvercrest Ranch in name, if not in fact, and heir to a legacy he'd done nothing to earn. What exactly had he agreed to? And what secrets lay hidden behind those sharp green eyes that had sized him up and found him suitable for such a strange bargain? Dawn broke over Silvercrest Ranch with streaks of pink and gold painting the sky. Jackson Reed stood at the window of his temporary guest room, watching ranch hands move about their morning duties with practiced efficiency. In a few hours, he would no longer be a visitor, but the legal husband of the most powerful woman in Teardrop Valley. Sleep had eluded him most of the night. The feather mattress, finer than anything he'd ever rested on, had felt alien beneath his back. The quiet of the grand house, broken only by the occasional creak of settling timber, had been somehow more disturbing than the raucous noise of Brewer's saloon that he'd grown accustomed to. A knock at the door drew his attention. "Mr. Reed, breakfast is served in the small dining room," called a woman's voice he didn't recognize. "Thank you. I'll be right down," he replied, turning to the basin of fresh water that had been provided. He washed his face and hands, then dressed in the same clothes he'd worn yesterday, the best he owned, pitifully inadequate in these surroundings. The small dining room proved to be larger than most saloons Jackson had frequented. Windows along, one wall overlooked a carefully tended garden, while a sideboard against the opposite wall held silver serving dishes under polished covers. Vivian Montgomery sat at the head of an oak table that could comfortably seat 12, though only 2. Places were set. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said, gesturing to the chair at her right. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough, thank you," Jackson lied, settling into the indicated seat. "And please, if I'm to call you Vivian, you should call me Jackson." A slight smile touched her lips. "Very well, Jackson, help yourself to breakfast. Mrs. Perkins makes excellent biscuits." A plump, grey-haired woman in a starched apron appeared silently at his elbow, pouring steaming coffee into his cup before retreating to the kitchen. Jackson served himself from the platters on the table: fluffy, scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, biscuits still warm from the oven, aware of Vivian's appraising gaze. "Judge Thornton will arrive at 9, she said, delicately cutting into a piece of melon. "After the ceremony, we'll depart immediately for Cheyenne. The bank opens at 11, which should give us ample time." "About that," Jackson said, setting down his fork. "I'd like to understand more about what happens after today. What exactly will my role be here?" Vivian took a sip of tea before answering. "Initially, you'll shadow Hank to learn the operations. You'll have access to the ranch. Accounts, though any expenditure over $50 will require my approval for the first year." She paused. "You'll be introduced to our business associates as my husband and future manager of Silvercrest. Some will be skeptical, others openly hostile. You would do well to remember that their opinions matter far less than your actions." Jackson nodded slowly. "And us? How do we conduct ourselves?" "With dignity and mutual respect," she replied simply. "We will dine together most evenings. You will accompany me to necessary social functions. Beyond that, your time is your own, provided your responsibilities to Silvercrest are met." Before Jackson could ask more questions, hoofbeats sounded outside, and Mrs. Perkins appeared at the doorway. "Judge Thornton has arrived, ma'am." "Earlier than expected," Vivian remarked, rising from the table. "Very well. Show him to the library, please. We'll join him shortly." She turned to Jackson. "Finish your breakfast. There's no need to rush." "But—" Jackson's appetite had vanished. He pushed his plate away and stood. "I'm ready now." Judge Ezekiel Thornton proved to be a tall, gaunt man with bushy white eyebrows and spectacles that magnified his pale blue eyes. He greeted Vivian with familiar warmth, but studied Jackson with undisguised curiosity. "So this is the young man," he said, his voice surprisingly deep. "Sullivan told me you'd found someone, Vivian, but I confess I'm surprised at the speed of this arrangement." "Time waits for no one, Ezekiel," Vivian replied evenly. "You have the papers?" "All in order," the judge confirmed, patting his leather satchel. "Though I do feel obliged to ask if you're certain about this course of action." "Quite certain," she said. "Shall we proceed?" The ceremony was brief and businesslike, conducted in the library with Hank Sullivan and Mrs. Perkins as witnesses. Jackson repeated the vows mechanically, feeling as though he were watching someone else slip a simple gold band onto Vivian Montgomery's slender finger. When it came time for his ring, she produced a heavy gold signet bearing the same stag's head emblem that adorned the ranch's entrance arch. "This was Howard's," she explained, sliding it onto Jackson's left hand. A symbol of Silvercrest's legacy, the ring felt impossibly heavy. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Thornton concluded, closing his Bible with a snap. "May God bless this union." There was no kiss, no embrace, just a firm handshake and the signing of marriage documents in triplicate. 1 hour after Judge Thornton's arrival, Jackson Reed had become Jackson Montgomery, husband to the wealthiest woman in 3 counties. As Vivian conversed quietly with the judge in the hallway, Hank approached Jackson. "Congratulations," he said, his tone impossible to read. "I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into." "I'm not sure anyone could," Jackson replied honestly. Mrs. Perkins appeared with Vivian's traveling cloak and a packed lunch for the journey to Cheyenne. Within minutes, Jackson found himself seated beside his new wife in an elegant black carriage drawn by 4 matched bays, the finest horses he'd ever seen up close. "What about Penny?" he asked suddenly as they pulled away from the house. "My mare. She's been moved to the stables and will receive proper care," Vivian assured him. "I've instructed the stablemaster to evaluate her condition. If she's sound, she'll join the Ranch Remuda. If not, she'll have a comfortable retirement." The consideration surprised him. "Thank you." The journey to Cheyenne took most of the morning, the miles passing in relative silence. Vivian seemed lost, in thought, occasionally making note of something in a small leather-bound journal she carried. Jackson watched the landscape roll by, trying to absorb the incredible turn his fortunes had taken in just 24 hours. Cheyenne was the largest city Jackson had ever visited, bustling with activity as the territorial capital. The carriage delivered them directly to the First Bank of Wyoming, an imposing stone structure on the main thoroughfare. Inside, they were immediately ushered into a private office where a portly banker named Hargrove awaited them. "Mrs. Montgomery." "What a pleasure," the banker effused, then caught himself. "Or should I say Mrs. and Mr. Montgomery now? News travels fast. Congratulations on your nuptials." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," Vivian replied coolly. "We have business to discuss regarding my husband's former debts." For the next hour, Jackson sat in mute astonishment as Vivian systematically dismantled the financial noose that had been tightening around his neck for years. She produced documentation showing predatory interest practices, questioned every charge, and ultimately negotiated a settlement of less than half what Jackson had been told he owed. "The remaining balance will be paid in full today," she concluded, signing a bank draft with a flourish. "And I'll expect a complete release of all claims against Mr. Montgomery's former property by the close of business tomorrow." Of course, Mrs. Montgomery," Hargrove stammered, clearly intimidated. "I'll have the documents prepared immediately." As they left the bank, Jackson turned to Vivian. "That was impressive. They were asking for $300. You paid less than $150. "They were robbing you," she said matter-of-factly. "Banking institutions count on desperation and ignorance to maximize their profits. Neither is a factor when dealing with me." Their next stop was Weatherby's Fine Clothiers, where Jackson was measured for 3 suits, a formal dinner jacket, riding clothes, and various other garments he could scarcely imagine needing. Vivian selected fabrics and styles with the same efficiency she'd shown at the bank, consulting Jackson only occasionally about his preferences. "The tailor will deliver everything to Silvercrest next week," she explained as they left the shop. "For now, we'll purchase ready-made essentials." By late afternoon, Jackson had acquired more clothing than he'd owned in his entire life, along with a new saddle, boots, and even a pocket watch to replace his father's broken timepiece. Throughout the shopping expedition, Vivian maintained a brisk, practical demeanor, treating the whole process like outfitting a new ranch hand rather than a husband. Their final stop was the territorial courthouse, where Judge Thornton had filed their marriage certificate and where, Jackson discovered, Vivian had other business to conduct. "I've updated my will," she informed him as they sat in yet another private office, this one belonging to a rail-thin lawyer named Pritchard. "You should understand the terms." Pritchard adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "The document is quite straightforward. Upon Mrs. Montgomery's death, Mr. Montgomery inherited Silvercrest Ranch in its entirety, including all livestock, equipment and cash reserves specifically associated with ranch operations." Jackson nodded, still uncomfortable with the topic. "Mrs. Montgomery's personal assets, including jewelry, artworks, investments and cash holdings not directly tied to Silvercrest, will be divided as follows. 30% to Mr. Montgomery, 30% to establish an educational foundation for children in Teardrop Valley, 20% to the Wyoming Cattlemen's Association, and the remaining 20% distributed among various named individuals who have served the ranch faithfully. I've provided for the staff," Vivian explained. "Those who have been loyal deserve security." The lawyer continued, "There is one significant condition attached to Mr. Montgomery's inheritance. Silvercrest Ranch must remain intact. No portions may be sold or subdivided for a minimum of 20 years following Mrs. Montgomery's death." "I understand," Jackson said quietly. "There is also a clause regarding the event of divorce," Pritchard added, glancing up. "Should the marriage be dissolved for any reason prior to Mrs. Montgomery's death, Mr. Montgomery would receive a settlement of $5,000, but no claim on Silvercrest or any other assets." The sum was generous, more money than Jackson had ever imagined possessing, but a fraction of Silvercrest's true worth. The message was clear. This arrangement was meant to be permanent. "Are the terms acceptable to you, Mr. Montgomery?" Pritchard asked. Jackson met Vivian's steady gaze. "They are." As their carriage traveled back to Silvercrest in the gathering dusk, Jackson finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind all day. "Why me, Vivian?" Truly, there must have been dozens of men who would have jumped at this opportunity. Men with more knowledge, better backgrounds. Vivian was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it before. "I've spent my life surrounded by men who wanted things from me. First, my father's associates, who saw only his money when they looked at me. Then Howard's friends, who measured my worth by the acres I brought to our marriage. After Howard died, there were countless suitors, widowers, bachelors, even a few whose wives were barely cold in their graves, all eyeing Silvercrest like vultures." She turned to look out the carriage window at the darkening landscape. "You needed what I offered, yes. But when I mentioned Silvercrest's legacy this morning, I saw something in your eyes beyond greed. You understood that some things have value beyond their price." The carriage rolled through Silvercrest's impressive gates just as the last light faded from the sky. Lanterns had been lit along the drive, guiding them to the main house where Hank Sullivan waited on the porch. "Everything go as planned?" he asked as he handed Vivian down from the carriage. "Without a hitch," she confirmed. "Please show Jackson to his quarters. I imagine he'd like to settle in." "Actually," Jackson said, "I'd prefer to check on Penny first, if that's all right." Something that might have been approval flickered in Vivian's eyes. "Of course. Hank, the stables first, then Mr. Montgomery's quarters." She turned to Jackson. "Dinner is at 7. Mrs. Perkins will show you to the dining room." With that, she ascended the porch steps and disappeared into the house, leaving Jackson to follow Hank toward the stables. "How was Cheyenne?" the foreman asked as they walked. "Educational," Jackson replied. "I'm beginning to understand why Mrs. Montgomery, Vivian, needs someone she can trust to take over eventually. There's so much more to Silvercrest than I realized." Hank nodded. "Most folks just see the land and the cattle. They don't see the business behind it all. Vivian's got investments all over the territory, mining interests, railroad shares, even part ownership in that new hotel they're building. In Cheyenne." He glanced sideways at Jackson. "Howard was a good rancher, but Vivian's the one who turned Silvercrest into an empire." The stablemaster, a weathered old cowboy named Emmett, had indeed taken good care of Penny. The mare had been brushed until her coat shone, her hooves cleaned and oiled, and she stood contentedly in a spacious stall with fresh hay and water. "She's a bit long in the tooth, but sound enough," Emmett reported. "Good disposition. Figure she's earned some easier days." Jackson stroked Penny's muzzle, feeling a wave of relief that at least his faithful companion would share in his change of fortune. From the stables, Hank led him to the main house and up a grand staircase to the west wing. "These are your rooms," he said, swinging open a polished door. Jackson stepped inside and froze in amazement. The suite consisted of a sitting room with comfortable leather furniture and bookshelves lining one wall, a bedroom with a massive four-poster bed, and a private bathroom with indoor plumbing, a luxury he'd encountered only in the finest hotels. His few possessions had been unpacked and arranged neatly, his spare clothes in the massive wardrobe, his dog-eared copy of The Odyssey placed prominently on the bedside table. Someone had even located his father's old shaving kit and positioned it on the bathroom vanity. "Dinner's in an hour," Hank reminded him. "Mrs. Perkins laid out some clothes for you on the bed. Vivian expects everyone at the table to be properly dressed." Left alone, Jackson sat heavily on the edge of the bed, running his hand over the fine linen suit that had been provided. Just yesterday, he'd been a debt-ridden cowboy sleeping in a rented room above a saloon. Today, he was master of Silvercrest Ranch, in name if not in fact, with fine clothes, a suite of rooms larger than his father's entire cabin, and a wife he barely knew. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, what secrets lay beneath the surface of this strange arrangement that had transformed his life so completely in the span of a single day? As he dressed for dinner in his borrowed finery, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stepped into a story far more complex than the simple business transaction Vivian had described. There were currents here he didn't understand, histories he couldn't guess at, and somewhere in the shadows of Silvercrest's grandeur lurked the real reason Vivian Montgomery, a woman who clearly needed no one, had chosen him to bear her name and inherit her legacy. The first days of Jackson's new life at Silvercrest passed in a whirlwind of introductions and discoveries. Each morning he rose at dawn to join Hank Sullivan for a tour of different aspects of the ranch operations. They inspected the northern pastures where the prize breeding stock grazed, examined the irrigation systems that kept Silvercrest green even in drought years, and visited the remote line cabins where cowboys stayed during cattle drives. "Mrs. Montgomery insists on knowing every inch of her property," Hank explained as they rode along a fence line on Jackson's third day. "Expects the same from anyone who calls themselves a Silvercrest man." Jackson nodded, taking in the vast sweep of land that stretched to the horizon. "How many acres total?" "Close to 20,000, Hank replied. "Original homestead was just 600 acres when Howard's grandfather settled here. Old Howard added another 5,000 during his time. Vivian's responsible for the rest." The information surprised Jackson. "She nearly tripled the size." Hard to imagine, ain't it? Most women would have sold after being widowed, especially with no children to pass it to. But Vivian, Hank shook his head admiringly. She's got vision, sees opportunities where others see only risk. Each evening, Jackson dined with Vivian in the formal dining room, dressed in the finest clothes he'd ever worn. Their conversations were polite but distant, focused primarily on ranch business, cattle prices, breeding programs, weather patterns that might affect the autumn roundup. She never inquired about his past beyond what she already knew, and he didn't volunteer information. It was a strange existence, being husband to a woman who remained essentially a stranger. They occupied the same house but lived separate lives, crossing paths only at scheduled intervals. Jackson's suite of rooms in the West Wing was a comfortable sanctuary, but he often felt like an intruder in the grand house, mindful of his footsteps on the polished floors, careful not to disturb the delicate balance that governed Silvercrest. On the morning.
In the hallway outside Vivian's private study, housekeeper carried the silver tray bearing a teapot, several small bottles.
He asked. Noting the medicine bottles, Mrs. Perkins regarded him with a measured gaze. "The mistress has her difficult days," she replied carefully. "Nothing to concern yourself with." But Jackson found himself concerned nonetheless. At dinner, that evening, he noticed the slight pallor beneath Vivian's composed expression, the careful way she held herself, as if any sudden movement might cause pain. "Is there anything I can do for you?" he asked, as Mrs. Perkins served the main course. Vivian looked up, surprise flickering briefly in her green eyes. "Do it for me?" "You seem unwell," Jackson said. "I thought perhaps—" "I'm perfectly fine," she interrupted, her tone closing the subject firmly. "Now, about the timber contract for the new bunkhouse." The conversation shifted back to ranch. A business, but Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had been hidden from him. That night, he lay awake in his luxurious bed, piecing together fragments of observation. The medicine bottles, Vivian's occasional wince when she thought no one was looking, the hushed conversations between Mrs. Perkins and Hank that ceased whenever he approached. On the 5th day, Jackson rode with Hank to the eastern boundary of Silvercrest, where a clear stream marked the division between Montgomery land and the neighboring Triple C Ranch. "Used to be bad blood between Silvercrest and the Crawfords," Hank explained, as they dismounted to water their horses. "Old Howard and Patrick Crawford were rivals from way back, fought over water rights, grazing permits, even the affections of a certain school teacher back in the day." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Vivian? Nah, this was before her time. Howard married Vivian when he was already in his 40s. She was from back east, Philadelphia, I think. Family had money but lost it all in some banking scandal. Howard met her on a business trip, brought her back as his bride." Hank chuckled softly. "Town gossips had a field day with that one. Young Eastern society lady marrying a rough-hewn rancher, 20 years her senior." Jackson absorbed this new information about his wife's past. What happened with the Crawfords? After Howard died, things got worse before they got better. Patrick Crawford tried to buy pieces of Silvercrest, thinking Vivian wouldn't be able to manage on her own. When she refused, he made life difficult, diverted water, stirred up trouble with the Cattlemen's Association. Hank's expression darkened. Then about 6 years ago, Triple C fell on hard times. Bad investments, from what I heard. Patrick Crawford took ill, and his son Garrett took over. And the feud. Vivian worked out a deal with Garrett, helped him restructure the Triple C's debts in exchange for water rights and a promise to stop the strong-arm tactics. Hank shrugged. "They've been cordial since, though I wouldn't call them friends." They were preparing to mount up when hoofbeats sounded from the direction of the Triple C. 2 riders approached, a tall man with broad shoulders and a thick mustache, accompanied by a younger cowboy. "Speak of the devil," Hank muttered. "That's Garrett Crawford himself." Crawford reined his horse to a stop a few yards away, studying Jackson with open curiosity. "Sullivan," he nodded to Hank, then turned his attention to Jackson. "You must be the new husband I've been hearing about. Crawford, Garrett Crawford, Jackson." "Montgomery," Jackson replied, noting the slight narrowing of Crawford's eyes at his use of Vivian's surname. "Heard you were a drifter before lucking into the Montgomery fortune," Crawford said, his tone just shy of insulting. "Must be quite the change of circumstances." Before Jackson could respond, Hank stepped forward. "Something we can help you with, Crawford?" Crawford's gaze lingered on Jackson a moment longer before shifting to Hank. Just checking the boundary line. Had some cattle stray across last week. My boys rounded them up, but I wanted to make sure the fence was secure. Appreciate the concern, Hank said dryly. We'll take it from here. Crawford touched the brim of his hat. Give my regards to Mrs. Montgomery. Tell her I hope she's feeling stronger. With that ambiguous comment, he turned his horse and rode away, his companion following silently. What did he mean about Vivian feeling stronger? Jackson asked as they watched the riders disappear into the distance. Hank's expression was unreadable. Not my place to say. You should ask her yourself if you want to know. That evening, Jackson found himself alone for dinner. Mrs. Perkins informed him that Vivian was resting and had taken a tray in her room. After an unsatisfying meal, he retreated to the library, drawn to the room's peaceful atmosphere and the comfort of books that had been his mother's legacy. He had just settled into a leather armchair with a volume on cattle breeding when the door opened and Vivian entered. She wore a simple navy dress rather than her usual formal attire, and her silver hair hung loose around her shoulders rather than styled in its customary elegant knot. The effect was startling. She appeared both younger and more vulnerable. I apologize for missing dinner, she said, moving to the fireplace where embers still glowed. Some days are more taxing than others. Jackson set aside his book. I met Garrett Crawford today. Vivian's back stiffened slightly. Did you? And what? Did Mr. Crawford have to say for himself? Not much. But he mentioned hoping you were feeling stronger. Jackson hesitated, then pressed on. Vivian, are you ill? For a long moment, she gazed into the fire, her profile etched against the soft light. Jackson thought she might refuse to answer, as she had before, but finally she turned to face him. I'm dying, Jackson, she said simply. Dr. Stevens gives me perhaps a year, though I suspect he's being generous. The blunt statement struck Jackson like a physical blow. Despite his suspicions, hearing the truth so plainly stated was jarring. What is it? Cancer, she replied, the word falling between them like a stone. It began in my breast and has spread to my bones, hence the occasional discomfort you've likely noticed. Is there no treatment? Perhaps doctors in Denver or even back east? I've consulted specialists from as far as Boston, she interrupted. The consensus is unanimous. At my age, aggressive treatments would only diminish what quality of life remains to me. She moved to sit in the chair opposite him. This is why our arrangement was necessary. I needed to secure Silvercrest's future before time ran out. Jackson felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Pity, respect, and a strange sense of betrayal that she hadn't trusted him with this information sooner. You should have told me. Would it have changed your decision? No, he admitted after a moment's reflection. But secrets make for poor foundations, especially in business arrangements. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. A fair point. Very well, no more secrets between us. Ask what you will. Jackson considered carefully. Crawford seemed to know about your condition. Garrett's wife, Rebecca, is Dr. Stevens' niece, Vivian explained. Small communities have few secrets, even between rival ranching families. And the staff, do they know? Hank and Mrs. Perkins? Yes, the others suspect, I imagine, but nothing has been said explicitly. She folded her hands in her lap, the wedding ring gleaming in the firelight. I don't want pity, Jackson. I've lived a full life, accomplished what I set out to do. All that remains is to ensure Silvercrest continues to thrive after I'm gone. Jackson nodded slowly, understanding more clearly now the urgency behind their hasty marriage and her methodical approach to teaching him about the ranch. What can I do? Learn quickly, she replied. Silvercrest isn't just acres and cattle. It's people, traditions, responsibilities. I need to know you can shoulder the weight of it all. I'll do my best, he promised. though the enormity of what she was asking settled like a heavy mantle across his shoulders. "That's all any of us can do," she said softly, rising from her chair. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I find I'm quite tired. Good night, Jackson." "Good night, Vivian," he replied, watching as she moved toward the door, with the same dignified grace she brought to everything. At the threshold she paused. "There's a dinner next week at the governor's residence in Cheyenne. I've accepted the invitation for both of us. It will be your first public appearance as my husband." "I'll be ready," Jackson assured her, though the prospect of mingling with territorial dignitaries filled him with dread. After Vivian departed, Jackson remained in the library for a long time, staring into the dying fire and contemplating the strange twist of fate that had brought him here. In less than a week, he had gained a wife, a fortune, and the knowledge that both came with an expiration date. The next morning it dawned crisp and clear. Jackson rose before sunrise, dressed in the riding clothes that had been provided for him, and made his way to the stables. He found Penny in her stall, looking healthier than she had in years thanks to regular grooming and proper feed. "Morning, old girl," he murmured, stroking her nose. "How about a ride for old time's sake?" He saddled her himself, despite the stable, Hen's offer of assistance, and rode out as the first light of day bathed Silvercrest in golden hues. Without any conscious destination in mind, he found himself following a narrow trail that wound into the foothills east of the main house. After about an hour's ride, he created a small rise and discovered a sight that took his breath away. Below him spread a hidden valley, carpeted in wildflowers and bisected by a crystal-clear stream. At the far end stood a small cabin, its chimney sending a thin spiral of smoke into the morning air. Curious, Jackson rode down into the valley. As he approached the cabin, the door opened, and an elderly man emerged, leaning on a walking stick. He wore a faded blue shirt and suspenders, his white hair wild around a deeply tanned face. "You must be the new husband," the old man called out, his voice surprisingly strong. "Wondered when you'd find your way up here." Jackson dismounted, tying Penny to a hitching post near the cabin. "I'm Jackson Montgomery, and you are?" "Samuel Taylor," the old man replied. "Been the caretaker of this valley for 30 years. Vivian never mentioned me, I reckon?" "No, she didn't," Jackson admitted. Samuel chuckled. "Figured as much. She keeps her cards close, so does our Vivian." He gestured toward the cabin door. "Come in for coffee? Looks like you and I have some talking to do." Jackson hesitated briefly, then nodded. Something told him that this unexpected encounter might provide insights into Silvercrest and his new wife that couldn't be found anywhere else. As he followed Samuel into the cabin, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he stood on the threshold of discoveries that would forever change his understanding of the bargain he had struck with Vivian Montgomery and the true nature of the legacy he had agreed to preserve. Samuel Taylor's cabin was a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed in one corner, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. Despite its simplicity, the space felt welcoming. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with earthy fragrance, and shelves lined the walls crowded with books, carved wooden figures, and various curiosities Jackson couldn't identify. "Sit," Samuel instructed, gesturing to one of the chairs as he moved to the fireplace where a coffee pot simmered on the edge of the hearth. "Been a long time since I had company up here." Jackson settled into the chair, watching as the old man poured steaming coffee into 2 tin cups. "Does Vivian visit?" "Not so much lately," Samuel replied, handing Jackson a cup. "Her health don't permit the ride anymore. Used to come every few weeks, though, ever since she first arrived at Silvercrest." "You've known her that long?" Samuel nodded, easing himself into the opposite chair with a soft grunt. "I was Howard Montgomery's right-hand man back then. Foreman before Sullivan." Watch the day he brought his Eastern bride home, this slip of a girl, with fire in her eyes and steel in her spine. He smiled at the memory. Townfolk thought she'd wither out here in the wilderness. Shows what they knew. "Why are you living up here instead of at the main house?" Jackson asked, sipping the strong, bitter coffee. "Choice, not banishment, if that's what you're thinking," Samuel said with a shrewd glance. "After Howard passed, I stayed on with Vivian for a few years. Then the rheumatism got so bad, I couldn't ride the range properly. Offered to retire, but Vivian suggested this arrangement instead. I keep an eye on this valley. It's a special place to her, and she makes sure I want for nothing." Jackson glanced around the cabin with new appreciation. "What's so special about this valley?" Samuel studied him over the rim of his coffee cup. "That's for Vivian to tell, not me. But I will say this. There's more to Silvercrest's history than most folks know, and more to your wife than meets the eye." "She's dying," Jackson said quietly. "I know." Samuel's weathered face softened with genuine sorrow. "Terrible thing watching. A spirit like hers trapped in a failing body makes this old man angry at the unfairness of it all." He set his cup down with a decisive thump. "But she's making the best of the time she has left. Always been her way. Facing life head on. No matter what it throws at her. Tell me about her and Howard," Jackson prompted. "What kind of marriage did they have?" Samuel leaned back in his chair, considering. Complicated, like most things worth having. Wasn't a love match at first, more a business arrangement, truth be told. Her family needed money. He needed a wife who could bring some refinement to Silvercrest. A hint of a smile played at the corners of his mouth, but something happened over the years, grew into a real partnership. Howard taught her ranching. She taught him there was more to life than cattle and ledger books. Were they happy? Most days I'd say yes. Howard could be a hard man, demanding, set in his ways. And Vivian never was one to bend just to keep peace. They had their battles. Samuel's eyes took on a faraway look, but they respected each other, and that's rarer than love in my experience. Jackson absorbed this, thinking of his own strange marriage, and wondering if respect might be the most he could hope for as well. "And they never had children?" A shadow crossed Samuel's face. "That's another story that's not mine to tell. Ask Vivian, if you're brave enough." He pushed himself to his feet. "Come on, want to show you something before you head back." Jackson followed the old man outside. Despite his age and the walking stick, Samuel moved with surprising agility as he led the way along a narrow path that followed the stream. They walked for about 10 minutes before reaching a small clearing where the ground rose slightly to form a grassy knoll. Atop it stood a single oak tree, its massive branches creating a canopy of dappled shade. "Howard's buried here," Samuel said simply, stopping at the foot of the knoll. "His choice, not in the town cemetery with the other Montgomerys. Just him and the valley he loved." Jackson climbed the gentle slope to examine the grave. A simple marble headstone marked the spot, engraved with Howard Montgomery's name, dates, and a single line. "The land endures." He wanted to be part of Silvercrest forever, Samuel explained from below. "Vivian visits when she can, though it's been months now." He hesitated, then added, "There's a spot next to him, waiting for her. She'll want to be buried here too when the time comes." The knowledge sat heavy in Jackson's chest as he descended the knoll. This hidden valley was more than just a pretty corner of Silvercrest. It was a sanctuary, a place of profound meaning to the woman he had married. Yet she had shared none of this with him. "Why are you telling me all this?" he asked as they walked back toward the cabin. Samuel gave him a sidelong glance. "Because Vivian won't, and you need to understand what you've gotten yourself into. Silvercrest isn't just land and cattle. It's generations of dreams, sacrifices, and secrets." He stopped, turning to face Jackson fully. "You seem like a decent man, but that's not enough. Vivian needs someone who'll honor what this place means, not just manage its assets." "I never asked for any of this," Jackson said defensively. But you accepted it, Samuel countered, and now you've got responsibilities that go beyond the legal papers you signed. His expression softened slightly. Look, son, I've known Vivian Montgomery for over 30 years. She doesn't make mistakes in judgment. If she chose you, she saw something worth believing in. They reached the cabin, and Jackson untied Penny from the hitching post. "Thank you for the coffee," he said, mounting his horse, "and the history lesson." Samuel nodded. "Come back any time. Get lonely up here, and I've got plenty more stories to tell." As Jackson turned Penny toward the trail, the old man called after him. "Check the East Wing study. Bottom drawer of the map cabinet. Might find some answers there." The cryptic suggestion echoed in Jackson's mind as he rode back to the main house. The morning had grown warm, but he barely noticed the heat, his thoughts consumed by all he had learned. By the time he reached the stables, a plan had formed in his mind. After leaving Penny in the care of a stable hand, Jackson made his way to the east wing of the house. Unlike the west wing where his quarters were located, this section felt older, less frequently used. The study Samuel had mentioned proved to be a small room lined with cabinets and drawers, clearly a workspace for managing the ranch's extensive property. The map cabinet stood against the far wall, a massive oak piece with dozens of shallow drawers. Jackson hesitated only briefly before pulling open the bottom one. Inside lay several rolled parchments, yellowed with age. He lifted them out carefully, spreading one across the room's central table. It was a survey map dated 1862, showing the original boundaries of what would become Silvercrest Ranch. Penciled notations marked water sources, elevations, and soil types. Nothing seemed particularly revealing. He examined the second roll, another map, this one from 1875, showing the expanded property after Howard Montgomery's early acquisitions. The third roll contained not a map, but a collection of documents bound with faded blue ribbon. Jackson untied it carefully, spreading the papers on the table. The first was a deed of sale for a parcel of land that included the hidden valley he had visited that morning. But it was the name of the seller that caught his attention. Taylor. Samuel Taylor. The pieces clicked into place. The valley hadn't originally been part of Silvercrest. It had belonged to Samuel Taylor or his family. But why would the former foreman sell his land only to continue living on it as a caretaker? Jackson flipped through the remaining documents, legal correspondences, bank drafts, and finally a handwritten letter addressed to Howard Montgomery. The faded ink was difficult to read in places, but the content sent a chill down Jackson's spine. "Howard, the arrangement stands as discussed. The valley and all rights to it transfer to you legally and completely. In return, I accept your assurance that the truth of what happened there will remain between us. Your wife need never know the full extent of your involvement nor the sacrifice. That allows her peace of mind today. Let us both find what redemption we can in the years ahead." Samuel Taylor Jackson stared at the cryptic message, trying to decipher its meaning. What truth was Samuel referring to? What involvement? And how did it connect to Vivian? The sound of the door opening startled him. He looked up to find Hank Sullivan watching him from the threshold, expression unreadable. "Finding anything interesting?" the foreman asked mildly, though his eyes were sharp as he took in the scattered documents. Jackson decided honesty was his best option. "I met Samuel Taylor this morning. He suggested I might find some answers here." "Old Samuel's been talking." "Has he?" Hank entered the room, closing the door behind him. Typical. Man never could mind his own business. He glanced at the letter still in Jackson's hand. "You understand what you're reading there?" "Not entirely," Jackson admitted. "But it seems Howard Montgomery and Samuel had some sort of agreement involving that valley, something they kept from Vivian." Hank sighed heavily, lowering himself into a chair across from Jackson. "It's not my story to tell, but since you're already digging—" He rubbed a hand across his jaw. "That valley was where Vivian lost her baby. The statement hung in the air between them, stark and devastating. She was about 5 months along, Hank continued quietly. Their only child. She'd gone riding despite Howard's objections, always was stubborn that way. Horse spooked her, threw her. Samuel found her, brought her back to the main house, but it was too late. He nodded toward the documents. Afterward, Howard bought the valley from Samuel. Said he couldn't bear knowing someone else might build there someday, change the place where his child's blood had soaked into the earth. Jackson felt a wave of sorrow for the woman he was just beginning to understand. Why keep Samuel on as a caretaker? Guilt, most likely, Hank replied. There were rumors back then, whispers that Samuel's teenage son might have been involved somehow. Nothing was ever proven, but the boy left town right after, never came back. He shrugged. Howard was a complicated man. Maybe keeping Samuel close was his way of keeping an eye on him, or maybe it was some kind of penance. Either way, that valley became sacred ground to both of them, and Vivian visits Howard's grave there, Jackson murmured, recalling Samuel's words. Every month for years, though less often now, with her health failing. Hank stood, gathering the scattered papers. She doesn't know about these letters or whatever arrangement Howard and Samuel made. Far as she's concerned, Howard bought that land as a gift for her, a private place for her grief. Should I tell her what I found? Hank considered the question seriously. What good would it do? Whatever secrets are buried in that valley have been there for decades. Let the dead keep their mysteries. He returned the documents to their ribbon binding and handed them to Jackson. But these are yours now or will be soon enough. What you do with them is your choice. Before Jackson could respond, a maid appeared at the door. Mr. Montgomery, Mrs. Montgomery is asking for you in the main parlor. The dressmaker has arrived for your final fittings for the governor's dinner. The mundane reality of tailoring measurements created a jarring contrast to the weight of what Jackson had just discovered. He followed the maid through the house, the bound documents still in his hand. At the last moment he detoured to his quarters, carefully storing the papers in the locked drawer of his writing desk before continuing to the parlor. Vivian sat in a wing-back chair near the window, instructing a nervous young woman who was arranging fabric samples on a side table. She looked up as Jackson entered, her expression betraying nothing of the physical discomfort she must have been feeling. "Ah, there you are," she said. "Miss Collins has brought the completed dinner jacket for a final fitting. We haven't much time before the governor's event." Jackson allowed himself to be measured and adjusted, standing patiently as Miss Collins pinned and marked the fine black wool. Throughout the process, he watched Vivian from the corner of his eye, seeing her now through the lens of all he had learned. Not just an aging businesswoman making practical arrangements for her legacy, but a woman who had endured profound loss and carried secret sorrows beneath her composed exterior. "Is something amiss?" Vivian asked, catching his gaze. "No," Jackson replied. "Just thinking about how much there is to learn about Silvercrest." Something flickered in her eyes. Wariness, perhaps. "It takes a lifetime to truly know a place like this. We must make do with the time we have." The statement hung between them, layered with meanings neither acknowledged openly. When the fitting concluded and Miss Collins departed with promises to deliver the finished garments the next day, Vivian remained in her chair, studying Jackson with renewed interest. "You rode out early this morning," she observed. "Did you find the exploration valuable? It was a perfect opening to mention his visit to Samuel, to ask about the valley and its significance. Instead, Jackson chose a different path." "I did. Silvercrest has many beautiful corners I've yet to discover." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you'll share your favorite places with me when you feel strong enough for such excursions." Surprise registered briefly on her face, followed by something that might have been appreciation. "Perhaps I will, when the weather cools." She rose from her chair with careful dignity. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have correspondence to attend to before lunch." As she passed him, moving toward the door with measured steps, Jackson was struck by the resilience it must require to maintain such composure in the face of physical pain and approaching mortality. Without thinking, he reached out, gently touching her elbow in a gesture of support. Vivian paused, glancing down at his hand, then up at his face. For a moment, the careful mask slipped, revealing vulnerability and a question she didn't voice. "Thank you," Jackson said simply. "For everything. You're teaching me about Silvercrest." Something softened in her expression. "You're a quick study, Jackson Montgomery. Perhaps Howard was right after all." Before he could ask what she meant, Vivian continued on her way, leaving Jackson to wonder what other secrets Silvercrest Ranch held, and how many of them he would discover before his strange marriage reached its inevitable conclusion. The governor's residence in Cheyenne stood as a testament to territorial ambition, a 3-story mansion of red brick with white columns and expansive grounds, where Wyoming's elite gathered to cement alliances and whisper deals behind crystal glasses of champagne. As their carriage joined the procession of vehicles approaching the illuminated entrance, Jackson tugged uncomfortably at his collar. "Stop fidgeting," Vivian murmured, her gloved hands folded serenely in her lap. "Remember, you're a Montgomery." Now, she looked regal in a gown of deep emerald silk that heightened the color of her eyes, her silver hair arranged in an elegant style adorned with a single emerald hairpin. Despite the pallor beneath her careful rouge, she projected an aura of authority that Jackson couldn't help but admire. "I've never attended anything like this," he admitted, as their carriage pulled to a stop at the entrance. "What if I use the wrong fork or say something inappropriate?" The corner of Vivian's mouth curved slightly. "Follow my lead with the cutlery. And as for conversation, speak little, listen much, and remember that a well-timed silence often serves better than hasty words." She turned to face him fully. "These people respect power and wealth, Jackson. Silvercrest has both. Stand tall and remember that you belong here as much as anyone." A footman opened the carriage door, and Jackson descended first, turning to offer Vivian his hand. As she stepped down, he noticed the momentary tightening of her features, a flash of pain quickly masked. On impulse, he tucked her hand securely into the crook of his arm, providing unobtrusive support as they ascended the steps to the entrance. "Thank you," she murmured, so quietly he almost missed it. The interior of the governor's residence dazzled with crystal chandeliers, polished marble, and the glitter of fine jewelry adorning Wyoming's most influential citizens. As they entered the main reception room, a hush fell over nearby conversations, heads turning to observe the infamous cattle baroness and her young husband. "Mrs. Montgomery." A portly man with impressive mutton-chop whiskers approached, hand extended. "Delighted you could join us tonight. And this must be your new husband we've heard so much about. Governor Barton." Vivian inclined her head graciously. "May I present my husband, Jackson Montgomery. Jackson, Governor Willis Barton." Jackson shook the offered hand firmly. "An honor, sir." The governor's gaze was assessing but not unfriendly. "Congratulations on your marriage. Mrs. Montgomery is one of our territory's greatest treasures, a true pioneer in the cattle industry." "I'm learning that daily," Jackson replied honestly. This seemed to please the governor, who laughed heartily. "I'm sure you are. Now, you must meet some of our other guests. The Attorney General is particularly eager to make your acquaintance, Vivian. Something about those water rights you've been negotiating with the Northern Pacific Railroad." For the next hour, Jackson found himself swept through a series of introductions to bankers, judges, politicians, and fellow ranchers. He observed Vivian carefully, noting how she navigated the complex social waters with practiced ease, offering just Enough information in business discussions to demonstrate her expertise, while revealing nothing that could disadvantage Silvercrest. "Jackson Montgomery," a familiar voice drawled behind him as he stood near the refreshment table. "Fancy seeing you in such elevated company." Jackson turned to find Garrett Crawford, immaculately dressed in formal attire, a crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand. Beside him stood a slender woman with auburn hair and intelligent eyes. "Crawford," Jackson nodded politely. "I didn't realize you'd be here tonight. The Triple C may not match Silvercrest's grandeur, but we still warrant an invitation to the governor's soirees," Crawford replied with a thin smile. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Rebecca." Jackson bowed slightly. Mrs. Crawford, Rebecca Crawford, offered a warm smile that contrasted with her husband's cool demeanor. "A pleasure, Mr. Montgomery. How are you finding life at Silvercrest? It must be quite an adjustment." "Every day brings new discoveries," Jackson replied diplomatically. "I'm sure it does," Crawford interjected. "Speaking of discoveries, I hear Samuel Taylor's been entertaining visitors lately. Interesting old fellow, isn't he? Full of historical insights." The pointed reference to Jackson's visit to the valley made it clear that little happened in Teardrop Valley without reaching Crawford's ears. Before Jackson could respond, Vivian appeared at his side, her hand settling lightly on his arm. "Mr. and Mrs. Crawford," she greeted them with perfect composure. "How lovely to see you both. Rebecca, that shade of blue is most becoming." "Thank you, Mrs. Montgomery," Rebecca replied. "I was just welcoming your husband to our little social circle." "How kind," Vivian said, though her grip on Jackson's arm tightened fractionally. "If you'll excuse us, the governor is about to make his address, and we should find our seats." As they moved away, Jackson bent his head toward Vivian. "Crawford knows I visited Samuel yesterday. Does everyone in the territory monitor my movements?" "In a community this size, very little remains private for long," Vivian replied calmly. "And the Crawfords have always taken a particular interest in Silvercrest affairs." She guided them toward a table near the front of the room. "What did Samuel tell you?" The directness of the question caught Jackson off guard. "He shared some of Silvercrest's history and showed me Howard's grave." Vivian's steps faltered almost imperceptibly. "I see." After a moment of silence, she added, "Samuel has been with Silvercrest longer than anyone. His perspective has value." The careful choice of words suggested there was more she wasn't saying. But before Jackson could pursue the subject, they reached their table where several other guests awaited them. The conversation shifted to safer topics: cattle prices, weather predictions for the coming winter, and territorial politics. Throughout dinner, Jackson found himself repeatedly drawn to observing Vivian. She participated in the conversations, around them with appropriate grace, but he noticed the fine lines of strain around her mouth, deepening as the evening progressed. When she declined dessert, citing a headache, he recognized it as the diplomatic excuse it was. "Perhaps we should depart early," he suggested quietly. "The drive back to Silvercrest is long." Gratitude flickered briefly in her eyes. "That might be wise. Would you mind making our apologies to the governor while I collect my wrap?" By the time they settled into their carriage for the return journey, Vivian's composure had begun to fray at the edges. In the privacy of the closed compartment, she leaned back against the cushions, eyes closed, her breathing carefully controlled. "Should I ask the driver to stop at the doctor's in town?" Jackson asked, genuinely concerned by her pallor. "No," she replied without opening her eyes. "There's nothing more Dr. Stevens can do tonight. I simply need rest." They rode in silence. For several miles, the rhythmic sway of the carriage and the steady clop of hooves the only sounds. Outside, the vast Wyoming landscape lay bathed in moonlight, the distant mountains etched against the star-filled sky. "You conducted yourself well tonight," Vivian said finally, her voice soft in the darkness. Several people commented favorably. "On your demeanor. I'm glad I didn't embarrass you," Jackson replied, surprised by how much her approval pleased him. Quite the contrary. She opened her eyes, studying him in the dim light filtering through the carriage windows. "You have a natural dignity that serves you well in such settings. With time and experience, you'll be more than capable of representing Silvercrest's interests." The praise warmed him unexpectedly. "Thank you. Though I still have much to learn." "Yes," she agreed, then hesitated. "Perhaps it's time I showed you the complete picture of what you've inherited." She shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. "Tomorrow, if my strength permits, I'll take you to my study. There are ledgers and documents you should see. Investments, beyond the ranch itself, that form the foundation of Silvercrest's financial security." Jackson recognized the significance of this offer. Until now, Vivian had shared only the most basic information about Silvercrest's operations, focusing on the practical aspects of ranching rather than the business empire she had built. "I'd appreciate that," he said simply. She nodded, then lapsed into silence again, her posture gradually relaxing as exhaustion overcame discomfort. By the time they reached Silvercrest's gates, Vivian had drifted into an uneasy sleep, her head tilted against the carriage wall. Jackson hesitated, then gently moved to sit beside her, offering his shoulder as a more comfortable support. In sleep, the lines of pain and determination that usually marked her face had softened, revealing glimpses of the younger woman she had once been. For the first time since their hasty marriage, he felt a surge of protectiveness that went beyond their business arrangement. When the carriage stopped at the main house, he didn't immediately wake her. Instead, he signaled the driver to wait, allowing Vivian a few more moments of rest before the effort of entering the house. "Vivian," he said softly when he could no longer delay. "We're home." Her eyes opened slowly, momentary confusion giving way to awareness of her position against his shoulder. Rather than pulling away abruptly, as he half expected, she straightened with deliberate calm. "Thank you," she said simply, "for your patience tonight." With Jackson's support, she managed the steps into the house with dignity and tact, though he could feel the tremors of exhaustion in her arm. Mrs. Perkins awaited them in the entryway, her concerned gaze taking in Vivian's condition at a glance. "Your evening tea is prepared, ma'am," the housekeeper said, "and I've laid out your night things." "Thank you, Mrs. Perkins." Vivian turned to Jackson. "If you'll excuse me, I think I'll retire immediately. We can discuss those business matters in the morning." He bowed slightly. "Of course. Rest well, Vivian." As Mrs. Perkins helped Vivian up the stairs, Jackson made his way to the library, finding himself drawn to the quiet sanctuary of books. The events of the evening had left him restless, his mind turning over all he had learned in the past week. The sound of approaching footsteps roused him from his thoughts. Hank Sullivan appeared in the doorway, still dressed despite the late hour. "Though I heard the carriage return," the foreman said. "How was the governor's shindig?" "Educational," Jackson replied, "though taxing for Vivian." Hank nodded, understanding. The unspoken concern. She pushes herself too hard, always has. He entered the room fully, closing the door behind him. "Got a message while you were gone. Rider from the Triple C, Garrett Crawford wants to meet with you. Just you, not Vivian." Jackson frowned. "Did he say why?" "Nope, just that it's important. And he'd prefer Mrs. Montgomery didn't know about it." Hank's expression remained neutral. "Said he'll be at Miller's General Store in town tomorrow at noon if you're interested." "What do you make of it?" The foreman considered this. "Crawford's not my favorite person, but he's not one for wasting time on petty games. If he says it's important, it probably is." He shrugged. "Course, important to the Triple C might not align with Silvercrest's interests." Jackson weighed the invitation against his growing loyalty to Vivian. "I should probably decline." Whatever Crawford has to say, Vivian should hear it too. "Your choice," Hank said. "Though sometimes information is valuable regardless of its source." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Vivian's planning to show you the investment ledgers tomorrow, isn't she?" Surprised, Jackson nodded. "How did you know?" "It's the natural next step. She's been working up to it." Hank's weathered face betrayed nothing of his thoughts. "Pay close attention to the entries from about 6 years back, when Triple C started having financial troubles. Might give you some context for whatever Crawford wants to discuss." With that cryptic suggestion, the foreman bid him good night, leaving Jackson with even more questions than before. Morning brought clear skies and a cool breeze that hinted at the approaching autumn. Jackson rose early, completed his usual ride around the near pastures with Hank, then returned to find Mrs. Perkins waiting for him on the porch. "Mrs. Montgomery sends her regrets," the housekeeper informed him. "She's unwell this morning and will remain in her room. She asks that you review these in her absence." She handed him a small brass key. "For the cabinet in her private study. The ledgers are inside." Concern for Vivian warred with curiosity about the financial records she had promised to share. "Is she in need of the doctor? I've already sent for him," Mrs. Perkins replied. "It's nothing unusual, just one of her difficult days. She'd prefer to rest without disturbance." Recognizing the gentle dismissal, Jackson accepted the key. "Please, let her know I'm available if she needs anything." Vivian's private study was located in a quiet corner of the main house, its windows overlooking the western pastures where Silvercrest's prized breeding stock grazed. Unlike the more formal spaces where she conducted ranch business, this room reflected personal touches. A finely woven Native American blanket draped over a reading chair, shelves lined with books that showed the wear of frequent handling, and a small collection of polished stones arranged on the windowsill. The cabinet, Mrs. Perkins had indicated, stood against the far wall, a handsome piece of walnut with intricate carvings. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock, revealing rows of leather-bound ledgers, each labeled with a year and quarter. For the next 2 hours, Jackson immersed himself in the financial history of Silvercrest Ranch. The ledgers revealed far more than cattle transactions and operational expenses. Vivian had built a complex web of investments spanning mining interests, railroad stock, timber rights, and commercial property in growing towns across the territory. Most fascinating were the entries from 6 years earlier, as Hank had suggested. Among the regular transactions appeared a series of substantial loans made to Triple C Ranch, secured against Crawford water rights and a parcel of prime grazing land that now formed part of Silvercrest's northern boundary. The terms were fair but firm. Annual interest at 6%, with provisions for Silvercrest to assume ownership of the collateral properties if payments lapsed for more than 6 months. Tucked between the ledger pages covering this period, Jackson discovered a folded letter on Triple C letterhead. The handwriting was angry, the pen having nearly torn through the paper in places. "Mrs. Montgomery, your generous offer is nothing but opportunistic vulturism. My father built Triple C from nothing, just as Howard built Silvercrest. The current financial straits are temporary, and your attempt to exploit them is transparent. Whatever personal grudges existed between our families should not dictate business decisions. Your husband may have respected my father as a worthy opponent, but you seem intent on destruction rather than competition. Be assured that Crawford land will remain Crawford land, regardless of whatever financial maneuvers you attempt. Garrett Crawford." The letter provided a stark contrast to the cordial, if cool, interaction Jackson had witnessed between Vivian and Crawford at the governor's dinner. Whatever conflict had existed between them appeared to have reached some resolution, though Crawford's invitation to meet secretly suggested lingering undercurrents. As Jackson replaced the ledgers and locked the cabinet, the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 11. He had just enough time to ride into town for Crawford's mysterious meeting if he decided to go. The proper course would be to inform Vivian, but her illness this morning made that impossible without disturbing. The rest she desperately needed. Weighing loyalty against curiosity, Jackson made his decision. He would meet Crawford and listen to what he had to say. After all, knowledge was never harmful in itself, only in how it was used. And perhaps understanding the full complexity of the relationship between Silvercrest and Triple C would help him better protect Vivian's interests in the future. With his mind made up, Jackson headed for the stables, instructing a hand to saddle Penny for the ride to town. Whatever Crawford wished to discuss, Jackson would approach it with caution, aware that his position at Silvercrest was no longer just a matter of financial security, but had evolved into something more complex, a commitment to preserve the legacy Vivian had entrusted to him, and perhaps, though he hardly dared acknowledge it, a desire to ease her final days with the knowledge that her life's work would continue in good hands. Miller's General Store occupied the corner of Copperhead Springs, Main Street, a two-story wooden structure that served as the town's primary supplier of everything from nails to sugar to fabric. As Jackson tied Penny to the hitching post outside, he found himself remembering how different his circumstances had been just 9 days earlier when he'd last walked these streets. A debt-ridden cowboy with no prospects, now returned as Jackson. Montgomery, husband to the wealthiest woman in the territory. The bell above the door jingled as he entered the store. Several patrons glanced up, recognition and curiosity evident in their expressions. Mrs. Miller, a plump woman with kind eyes, emerged from behind the counter. "Mr. Montgomery," she greeted him with a warmth that surprised him. "How lovely to see you. Is there something specific I can help you find today?" "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. I'm actually here to meet Mr. Crawford." "Of course. He's waiting in the back room." She lowered her voice. "There's coffee if you'd like some." Jackson followed her through the store to a small room behind the main floor that appeared to serve as both office and storeroom. Garrett Crawford sat at a table in the center, a ledger open before him and a coffee cup at his elbow. "Montgomery," Crawford acknowledged, closing the ledger. "Wasn't sure you'd come." "Your message suggested urgency," Jackson replied, taking the seat opposite him. "I'm listening." Crawford studied him for a moment. "Coffee?" "Please." As Mrs. Miller poured a cup and set it before Jackson, Crawford waited in silence. Only when the door closed behind her did he speak again. "I'll be direct. How much do you know about Vivian Montgomery's financial dealings over the past decade?" Jackson kept his expression neutral, recalling the ledgers he'd reviewed that morning. "I know she's a shrewd businesswoman who's built Silvercrest into one of the most successful operations in Wyoming." "Shrewd," Crawford repeated with a humorless laugh. "That's one word for it. Ruthless might be another." He leaned forward. 6 years ago, Triple C fell on hard times. Bad investment in a mining operation that went bust, followed by 2 seasons of poor cattle prices. My father was ill, dying, as it turned out, and I was struggling to keep our ranch afloat. "Vivian provided loans," Jackson said evenly. Crawford's eyebrows rose slightly. "So she's shown you that much?" "Yes, she offered financial assistance. What the ledgers won't show is the conversation that accompanied those offers." "Which was?" "She made it clear the loans were just the beginning. Her ultimate goal was to absorb Triple C entirely into Silvercrest." Crawford's jaw tightened. "My father spent 40 years building our ranch. I wasn't about to let it disappear into Montgomery Holdings without a fight." Jackson sipped his coffee, considering this. "Yet you accepted the loans." "We needed the capital," Crawford acknowledged. "And I've repaid every cent with interest, but that's not why I asked you here." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This arrived by courier yesterday, from Vivian's lawyers in Cheyenne." Jackson accepted the document, scanning its legal language. It appeared to be notification of Silvercrest's intent to purchase water rights to Cottonwood Creek, which formed part of the boundary between the two ranches. Triple C depends on that water access, Crawford explained. Without it, our southern pastures become nearly worthless during dry seasons. Vivian knows this. Why bring this to me instead of responding directly to her? Crawford sat back, studying Jackson intently. Because I'm not convinced this is Vivian's doing. The timing is suspicious. This kind of aggressive move doesn't align with our recent understanding. He paused. Since her diagnosis, we've reached a certain détente. She even advised me on refinancing options that saved Triple C considerable expense. The mention of Vivian's illness in such frank terms momentarily caught Jackson off guard. You know about her condition? Everyone with connections in Cheyenne knows, Crawford replied, though it's not discussed openly out of respect. His expression softened marginally. Whatever differences exist between our families, I wouldn't wish such an end on anyone. Jackson considered the document again. If Vivian didn't initiate this, who did? That's what I'm trying to determine. Crawford leaned forward. There are others who stand to benefit from conflict between our ranches, bankers, lawyers, competitors for government contracts. And with Vivian's health declining, some might see an opportunity to manipulate Silvercrest's affairs. You think someone's acting without her knowledge, Jackson concluded, or with limited oversight. Crawford met his gaze directly. Look, Montgomery, I have no love for Silvercrest encroaching on Crawford land, but I respected Howard, and I've come to respect Vivian, despite our differences. What I don't respect is opportunists taking advantage of her condition to pursue their own agendas. The accusation hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Could Jackson himself be one of those opportunists? I'll look into this, Jackson said finally, folding the document and slipping it into his pocket. If there's been a misunderstanding, I'll see it corrected. Crawford's expression remained skeptical. Just like that, you'll intervene against your own potential interests? Silvercrest's interests and Vivian's wishes are what matter to me, Jackson replied firmly. Not my own gain. Something shifted in Crawford's assessment. You're either an excellent actor or not quite the fortune hunter I took you for. I'm neither, Jackson said, rising from his chair. Just a man trying to honor a commitment. As they exited the back room to the main store, Crawford paused. One more thing, Montgomery. There's talk in town about Samuel Taylor. Seems his cabin was broken into last night while he was visiting his sister in Laramie. Nothing valuable was taken, but his papers were disturbed. Jackson felt a chill of unease. Who would do that? Someone looking for information, clearly. Crawford adjusted his hat. I'd keep a close eye on those old records if I were you. History has a way of becoming valuable when futures are uncertain. With that cryptic warning, Crawford nodded farewell and departed, leaving Jackson to consider all he had learned. As he untied Penny for the ride back to Silvercrest, the questions multiplied in his mind. Who had initiated the water rights action against Triple C without consulting Vivian? Who had searched Samuel's cabin, and what were they looking for? And how did these events connect to his own unusual marriage? The ride back to Silvercrest gave Jackson time to organize his thoughts. By the time the ranch's gates came into view, he had decided on a direct approach. He would show Vivian the water rights document and gauge her reaction. If she had authorized it, he would understand her reasoning. If not, they had a more serious problem of someone acting in her name without proper authority. Upon his return, he was met by Mrs. Perkins, who informed him that Vivian was still resting and Dr. Stevens had visited, prescribing stronger medication for her pain. She asked for you, though, the housekeeper added. Said you should join her for tea in her sitting room at 4 o'clock if you're available. "Of course," Jackson replied. "Has Hank returned from the North Pasture?" "Not yet. He sent word they're having trouble with that new irrigation pump. Likely won't be back till sundown." Jackson nodded, thanking her before retiring to his quarters to freshen up. The invitation to Vivian's private sitting room, a space he had yet to enter, suggested she was feeling somewhat improved and perhaps ready for the conversation he needed to have with her. At precisely 4 o'clock, Jackson knocked at the door. To Vivian's suite in the East Wing. Her soft enter guided him into an elegantly appointed sitting room decorated in shades of blue and silver. Unlike the formal public rooms of Silvercrest, this space felt genuinely personal. Bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes, a writing desk cluttered with correspondence, and several framed photographs he itched to examine more closely. Vivian sat in a comfortable armchair near the window, a lap robe covering her legs despite the mild temperature. She looked pale but composed, her silver hair arranged simply rather than in its usual elegant style. "Jackson," she greeted him. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." He took the chair opposite hers, noting the tea service arranged on the small table between them. "How are you feeling?" "Better than this morning, though that's a low bar to clear," she replied with unexpected candor. "Dr. Stevens has adjusted my medication. It helps with the pain but leaves my thoughts less precise than I prefer." She gestured to the teapot. "Would you pour?" "My hands are not entirely reliable today," Jackson obliged, filling 2 delicate porcelain cups with fragrant tea. As he handed one to Vivian, their fingers brushed briefly, and he was struck by how cold her hands felt despite the warm day. "I understand you reviewed the financial ledgers this morning," she said, after taking a careful sip. "Yes, they were most enlightening." He hesitated, then decided to approach the subject directly. "I also saw the correspondence regarding Triple. See, from 6 years ago," Vivian nodded slowly. "A complicated period. Garrett Crawford is much like his father, proud, stubborn, and occasionally blind to practical realities." A slight smile touched her lips. "We understand each other better now than we did then." The opening seemed perfect. "I happened to see a Crawford in town today," Jackson said, watching her face carefully. "He showed me a document from your lawyers regarding Cottonwood Creek water rights." Surprise flickered across Vivian's features before she could mask it. "Did he? And what did this document propose?" "Silvercrest's purchase of Triple C's access rights to the creek," Jackson replied, reaching into his pocket to retrieve the folded paper. "It appears to have been filed just 3 days ago." Vivian accepted the document, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she scanned its contents. "This was not authorized by me," she said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Nor would I have approved such an action. Garrett and I reached an understanding about Cottonwood Creek last year. This document directly contradicts our agreement." "Crawford suspected as much," Jackson said. "He thought the timing seemed off." "Indeed." Vivian set the paper down with precise movements that betrayed her agitation. "This bears further investigation. Walter Pritchard is my primary attorney in Cheyenne. He would never have proceeded with such a filing without my explicit instruction." She fixed Jackson with a penetrating gaze. "Did Crawford say anything else of note?" Jackson considered whether to mention the break-in at Samuel's cabin, then decided for full disclosure. "Yes. Apparently, someone searched Samuel Taylor's cabin while he was away visiting family. Papers were disturbed, though nothing of value was taken. This news seemed to trouble Vivian even more deeply." She closed her eyes briefly, her hand tightening on the armrest of her chair. "I see. The events may be connected." "Connected how?" Jackson prompted when she didn't elaborate. Vivian seemed to come to a decision. "Jackson, it appears I've been remiss in fully informing you about certain aspects of Silvercrest's situation." She set her teacup down with deliberate care. There are individuals who have long coveted this land and its resources. Howard's family fought to protect it, as have I. Now that my health is failing and a new Montgomery leads Silvercrest, those individuals may see an opportunity to advance old agendas. Who specifically? Jackson asked. The Eastern Wyoming Land and Cattle Company, for one, Vivian replied. A consortium of Eastern investors with political connections in the territorial government. They've tried repeatedly to acquire portions of both Silvercrest and Triple C, particularly the watershed areas. She indicated the document. This legal maneuver bears their hallmarks, creating conflict between neighboring ranches that might lead to forced sales or governmental intervention. And you think they might have searched Samuel's cabin as well? Looking for what? Vivian hesitated. Samuel has been with Silvercrest since before Howard's time. He possesses historical knowledge that could be exploited by the wrong people. She met Jackson's gaze directly. There are aspects of Silvercrest's early land acquisitions that, viewed through modern legal standards, might provide leverage for challenges to our titles. The careful phrasing suggested complexities beyond what Vivian was willing to share. Even now, Jackson recalled Samuel's cryptic letter to Howard that he'd discovered in the East Wing study, the mysterious arrangement and reference to truths Vivian never knew. I should speak with Samuel when he returns, Jackson suggested. If someone is targeting him to get to Silvercrest, he should be warned. Yes, though I'd prefer to handle that conversation myself. Samuel and I have a complicated history. Vivian shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. More immediately, I need to contact Pritchard and determine who authorized this filing against Triple C. It may require a trip to Cheyenne. You're in no condition to travel, Jackson objected. Perhaps not, which means you must go in my stead. She studied him thoughtfully. Would you be comfortable representing Silvercrest's interests in this matter? It would involve meetings with Pritchard, and possibly confronting whoever is behind this unauthorized action. The request represented a significant shift in their relationship, Vivian explicitly asking him to act not just as her husband in name, but as her proxy in business affairs. Of course, he replied without hesitation. I'll leave first thing. Tomorrow, if you'd like? Yes, that would be best. Relief softened her features. Hank will accompany you. He knows the key players in Cheyenne and can advise on who can be trusted. She leaned back in her chair, fatigue evident in the slump of her shoulders. This is not how I envisioned spending our 9th day of marriage, sending you to untangle conspiracies. The reference to 9 days struck Jackson suddenly. According to the story that had spread through Teardrop Valley, he had married a wealthy old woman for her money, only to discover shocking truths afterward. The narrative wasn't entirely false, but the reality had proven far more complex than anyone could have imagined. In just over a week, he had gone from destitute cowboy to defender of one of Wyoming's greatest ranches, and somewhere along the way, his motivation had shifted from self-interest to genuine concern for the stern, remarkable woman who had chosen him from all possible candidates to carry on her legacy. Vivian, he said carefully, these people, whoever they are, they're counting on your illness and my inexperience to create vulnerability. They don't know that I... He paused, searching for the right words. That you what, Jackson? She prompted softly. That I've come to care about Silvercrest and its mistress beyond our arrangement, he finished. I won't let them use either of us. Something flickered in Vivian's green eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a deeper emotion she wasn't prepared to reveal. I believe you, she said finally, which is why I'm entrusting you with this task. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the sitting room, Jackson found himself reluctant to leave Vivian's company. They continued, talking, moving from business concerns to memories of her early days at Silvercrest, when she had arrived as a young bride from Philadelphia, completely unprepared for the challenges of ranch life. Howard expected me to fail, she recalled with a hint of amusement. He'd married me for my family connections back east, never imagining I'd take an interest in the actual running of Silvercrest. I think he was rather shocked when I started, questioning his breeding programs and investment strategies. I can imagine, Jackson smiled, you don't strike me as someone who sits idly by. No, that was never my nature. Her gaze drifted to one of the photographs on a nearby table, a younger Vivian on horseback beside a tall, stern-faced man Jackson assumed was Howard Montgomery. We had our struggles, but eventually formed a partnership neither of us had anticipated. When he died, continuing his work, our work, became my purpose. The quiet admission offered a glimpse into what had driven Vivian to build Silvercrest, into the empire it now was, and perhaps why preserving it mattered so deeply to her. As darkness fell and Mrs. Perkins arrived with Vivian's evening medication, Jackson reluctantly took his leave. At the door, Vivian called his name once more. "Jackson," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Whatever you discover in Cheyenne, come back to Silvercrest, to me." The simple request, delivered without her usual commanding tone, touched something in him he hadn't expected. "I will," he promised. "You have my word." As he walked the long corridor back to his quarters, Jackson found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 9 days ago, he had entered into this marriage as a business transaction, a means of survival, when all other options had vanished. He had expected to play a role, to perform duties in exchange for security. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly Silvercrest would begin to feel like home, or how the stern, proud woman who had offered him this bargain would awaken in him not just respect, but a fierce protectiveness. Tomorrow he would ride to Cheyenne not as a hired representative, but as Jackson Montgomery, defending what was his by right and choice. Whatever forces were aligning against Silvercrest would soon discover that Vivian hadn't just secured a caretaker. For her legacy, she had found its champion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.